me one good reason why I shouldn't get him.
Because he's got a bigger gun.
Wait a minute, hold.
The Partridge Family premiered on ABC on September 25th, 1970, and immediately became one of the most successful television properties of the early decade. A family band sitcom that somehow managed to produce real hit records at the same time. It ran for 4 seasons, launched a genuine pop star, and then ended in 1974 without much fanfare. What happened between the premiere and the cancellation is a story about ego, bad decisions, industry politics, and the specific way that television success can create the conditions for its own collapse. This is The Partridge Family, 1970, How the Classic Sitcom Fell Apart.
It's always nice to return home to those you love, honor, and respect.
Okay. What?
The concept in the pilot, an improbable idea that worked. The show was created by Bernard Slade and produced by Bob Claver for Screen Gems, which was Columbia Pictures' television production division. The premise was straightforward in the way that premises in 1970 network television were required to be. A widowed mother, Shirley Partridge, and her 5 children form a family pop music group and travel the country in a converted school bus performing gigs. The concept was loosely inspired by the real-life Cowsills family, a Rhode Island family pop group that had achieved genuine commercial success in the late 1960s, with hits including The Rain, The Sunshine, and You, and Hair, which reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 in May 1969. The network originally approached the Cowsills about appearing in the show, but negotiations broke down, reportedly because the Cowsills' mother, Barbara Cowsill, who was genuinely part of the performing family, was excluded from the casting arrangement when producers decided not to include her. The Cowsills walked away, the show moved forward with actors, and the central casting choice became Shirley Jones, an Oscar-winning actress who won Best Supporting Actress for Elmer Gantry in 1960. Jones brought significant credibility to what was otherwise a fairly lightweight concept, and her presence signaled that Screen Gems was investing in something more than a disposable novelty. The decision to cast David Cassidy as eldest son Keith Partridge, a last-minute addition to the role, reportedly suggested by his stepmother Shirley Jones, who had married David's father Jack Cassidy in 1956, turned out to be the most commercially consequential casting choice in the show's history. Cassidy was 20 years old and had minor television credits, but had not established any significant professional profile before getting the role. Within 2 years, he would be one of the most recognizable young men in the world and one of the highest-paid entertainers in American entertainment. The music component was handled by Wes Farrell Productions, which licensed the Partridge Family name and produced the actual recordings. The actual session musicians included Hal Blaine on drums, Larry Knechtel on keyboards, Joe Osborne on bass, and other members of the Los Angeles studio community known informally as the Wrecking Crew. The same players who had recorded for the Beach Boys, the Mamas and the Papas, Simon and Garfunkel, and dozens of other major acts. David Cassidy sang lead on most of the recordings. Shirley Jones sang on some tracks. The rest of the cast was largely not on the records in any audible way, though they mimed playing instruments on the show. The pilot was filmed in spring 1970. The first single, I Think I Love You, was released in October 1970, peaked at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, and sold over 1 million copies. The show was a hit. The music was a hit. Everything was working simultaneously and almost immediately. The question that would take 4 years to fully answer was whether any of it was built to last.
It says right here in the script, Mama.
No, that's not the word, it's your attitude. Keith, this is a terrible...
The Cassidy problem, when the star outgrows the show. David Cassidy's rise from supporting cast member to global teen idol happened at a speed that the show's producers, the network, and arguably Cassidy himself were not fully prepared to manage. By the second season, the Partridge Family was fundamentally a vehicle for Cassidy's pop music career and his fan management, rather than a conventional ensemble sitcom. And that transformation created structural problems that would eventually prove fatal to the show's dynamic. The commercial success was undeniable. I think I love you. Doesn't somebody want to be wanted? I'll meet you halfway. I woke up in love this morning. These were genuine pop hits that appeared simultaneously on the Billboard Hot 100 and on the television show. David Cassidy's face appeared on Tiger Beat, 16 magazine, and essentially every other teen publication that existed. His fan mail volume at one point was reportedly the largest of any entertainer in the world. His concert tours sold out arenas in 1971, 1972, and 1973, with scenes of fan hysteria that were being compared in contemporary press coverage to Beatlemania. The comparison was not unreasonable. The scale of the reaction to Cassidy at his peak was genuinely extraordinary by any historical measure of American pop stardom. The machinery required to manage a phenomenon of that scale, the management, the publicists, the label relationships, the fan club infrastructure, the television production, and the touring operation, was enormous and created enormous commercial momentum that was difficult to redirect once established. Everyone in that machinery had a financial interest in Cassidy remaining the specific version of himself that had generated the phenomenon, which was Keith Partridge / teen idol / family-friendly pop star. And Cassidy increasingly did not want to be that. The other cast members watched this concentration of attention from inside a show that nominally featured an ensemble but functionally featured one person above all others. Danny Bonaduce, who played second son Danny Partridge, and who has been consistently the most candid voice about the show's internal reality, described in his 1994 memoir and in subsequent interviews a working environment where the imbalance between Cassidy's trajectory and everyone else's was visible and felt. The promotional materials, the fan coverage, and the industry attention all pointed in one direction. The other Partridges were context for the Cassidy phenomenon, rather than independent creative contributors. Cassidy himself has spoken about the toll that his level of fame took on him personally. In his 2014 memoir, Could It Be Forever? And in late career interviews, he described the loss of any private self, the dehumanizing quality of being an idol to millions of people who related to an image rather than a person, and the specific frustration of being one of the most famous people in the world while being unable to be taken seriously as a musician or a dramatic actor. His relationship with the Partridge Family became increasingly fraught as the gap between what the show represented and what he wanted to be grew wider through the third and fourth seasons.
What?
Introduce Dora.
Reuben, you said you were going to take care of this.
It's taken care of.
Behind the set, tensions that didn't make the screen. The family sitcom format relies on the audience's belief in a coherent family unit, and the Partridge Family's cast was, behind the cameras, working through the kind of interpersonal dynamics that the show's scripts were explicitly designed to avoid. The combination of wildly unequal career trajectories, the specific pressures of child stardom, and the institutional decisions made by the producers and the network created conditions where the on-screen warmth was a performance rather than a reflection of any off-screen reality. Danny Bonaduce's experience is the most documented case. The child performer protection laws in place in California in the early 1970s, primarily the 1939 Coogan Act, named for child actor Jackie Coogan, whose earnings had been dissipated by his parents, had been strengthened somewhat, but were still far from adequate in guaranteeing that child actors' earnings were protected and available to them when they reached adulthood. Bonadeuce's father, Joseph Bonadeuce, managed his son's career and finances in ways that Danny has described in subsequent interviews and in his memoir as leaving him without meaningful savings from the show's run. Earnings that should have been substantial given the show's ratings and Danny's consistent visibility as the second most recognized Partridge after Cassidy. Susan Day, who played eldest daughter Lori, and who was the cast member closest in age and career trajectory to Cassidy, was struggling with an eating disorder during the show's run, anorexia that she has discussed publicly in the decades since the show ended. This was not visible to the audience and was not meaningfully addressed by anyone in the production. The institutional awareness of eating disorders and the appropriate response to them in a teenage performer in a high-pressure production environment in 1971 and 1972 was essentially non-existent by contemporary standards. The show's writers and the production decisions consistently prioritized Cassidy's star power at the expense of narrative development for other characters. Shirley Jones, as the adult lead and by far the most credentialed performer on the show, had limited creative input into the scripts and has expressed in later interviews her frustration with the direction of the show, particularly in later seasons when the scripts became formulaic and her character had less to do. Jones was diplomatic about it, but the frustration was real. Jeremy Gelbwaks, who played youngest son Chris Partridge in the first season, was replaced by Brian Forster for the second season, reportedly because the Gelbwaks family relocated out of the production area and Jeremy did not want to continue. Gelbwaks has said in later years that the circumstances were complicated and that the experience of being a child performer on a major network series carried pressures that the public visibility of the show did not fully represent.
I understand that mothers need an occasional romantic interlude.
It's not a romantic interlude. As a matter of fact,
The music situation, records without artists. One of the more specific and ultimately destabilizing aspects of the Partridge Family's success was the gap between the music's commercial identity and the reality of who made it. The Partridge Family as a musical act existed primarily on two levels: what audiences saw on television and what was on the records. These were not the same thing, and the people involved knew it in different ways and with different degrees of discomfort. The session musicians who recorded the Partridge Family tracks, primarily the Los Angeles-based studio players who had worked on records ranging from the Beach Boys to Phil Spector's Wall of Sound Productions, were not credited on the Partridge Family albums. This was standard practice in the era and not specific to the Partridge Family, but it created an inherent artificiality to the band's identity that became more uncomfortable as the show's success grew and the band was expected to have a public existence. David Cassidy could and did perform the songs live. His concert tour was genuinely active in 1972 and 1973, and he was a capable live performer. The rest of the cast was not touring. The Partridge Family on television performed as a band. The Partridge Family as a commercial music entity was David Cassidy with studio backing. The fiction was sustainable during the show's peak, but became increasingly difficult to maintain as Cassidy moved toward a solo career and as the show's ratings began to decline. The Bell Records relationship, Bell Records distributed the Partridge Family catalog, provided significant commercial infrastructure for the show's music operation, but was not designed to sustain an indefinite musical franchise attached to a television show. When Cassidy moved to establishing a solo identity distinct from the Partridge Family, the musical component of the show lost its commercial momentum, and without the music hit component, the show was a less distinctive product. Wes Farrell, who oversaw the music production, did what he could to maintain the quality of the recordings through the show's run, But by the fourth season, the music was no longer generating the hit singles that had been part of the show's identity in its first 2 seasons. The last chart single of meaningful note was Looking Through the Eyes of Love in 1973, which reached number 39. After that, the music component was effectively finished as a commercial force.
I give up. I have been as reasonable as any one person can be.
The rating slide. What killed the show's audience? The Partridge Family's ratings peaked in the first 2 seasons and began declining in the 3rd season, 1972 to 1973, continuing through the 4th and final season, 1973 to 1974. The show never experienced the abrupt kind of collapse that results in mid-season cancellation. It faded with a consistency that made ABC's eventual non-renewal decision feel less like a cancellation and more like a formality. By early 1974, when ABC confirmed there would be no 5th season, no one inside the production was surprised. Several factors contributed to the ratings decline in an interconnected and mutually reinforcing way. The show's format was inherently resistant to evolution. A family drives around in a painted bus, performs concerts, and navigates family-sized problems. And the scripts in seasons 3 and 4 became visibly repetitive to an audience that had already watched 2 seasons of the same essential formula. The cast, particularly the adults, was performing material that had diminishing creative substance, and performers cannot conceal that indefinitely. The Rolling Stone interview with Cassidy in May 1972 was a specific public event that changed the show's relationship with its core audience in ways that were difficult to reverse. The interview, a lengthy feature in which Cassidy discussed his dissatisfaction with his image, his use of marijuana, his relationships, and his desire to be taken seriously as an adult entertainer, was accompanied by a photograph by photographer Frank Tidy that generated significant controversy. More consequentially for the show, the interview made Cassidy's attitude toward his own fame and toward the Partridge Family product explicit to the audience that had been his most devoted supporters. The message, intentional or not, was that he was not Keith Partridge and did not want to be. That is a complicated message to deliver to the people who watch a show because they love Keith Partridge. The show's time slot shifted during its run, and the competitive landscape of ABC's Friday and Saturday night lineup changed in ways that were not favorable to the Partridge Family. Network television in the early 1970s was beginning the transition toward more socially engaged programming. All in the Family had premiered on CBS in January 1971 and demonstrated that audiences were receptive to television that engaged with contemporary social reality rather than avoiding it. The Partridge Family's cheerful unreality was not designed to compete in that environment, and as the cultural moment shifted, the show's position as a mainstream commercial product became more precarious. The animated spin-off, The Partridge Family, 2020 AD, which aired on CBS Saturday mornings in 1974, after the live-action series had ended, was a brand extension that produced neither critical nor commercial impact and is now primarily remembered as evidence of the production company's attempt to extract additional commercial value from the franchise after its primary vehicle had run out. Cancellation and what came after. ABC did not renew The Partridge Family for a 5th season, and the show concluded with its final episode, airing on March 23, 1974. The ending was quiet. There was no finale designed for the occasion, no farewell special, no episode that acknowledged it was the last one. Shootout at the OK Partridge was a standard episode of the show that happened to be the final one produced. The series ended and the bus stopped, And that was that. David Cassidy immediately pursued a solo career with results that were commercially decent in the United Kingdom and Australia, but did not replicate the Partridge Family era success in the United States. The teen idol moment had passed by 1974. This is the nature of that category of celebrity, which is intense and specifically tied to a demographic cohort that ages through it and moves on, usually within 2 to 4 years of initial impact. The audience that had made Cassidy a phenomenon in 1971 was 17 or 18 by 1974 and no longer organizing its entertainment consumption around teen magazine coverage and fan clubs. His subsequent recordings for Bell Records and then for RCA Victor produced limited American chart success, though a 1985 stage role in London's West End production of Time and a late career Las Vegas run demonstrated that his performing ability had not diminished. Shirley Jones continued working steadily in film and television throughout the subsequent decades. Guest roles, television movies, stage work, proving that her pre-Partridge Family career credentials were not merely historical, and that the show had been a commercially successful interlude in a longer and genuinely accomplished career. She has spoken about the Partridge Family with relative affection in retrospective interviews, characterizing it as work she did professionally and without regret, which is more than some of her castmates managed. Danny Bonadus's post-show trajectory was the most publicly documented of the child cast members. Addiction, legal trouble, and homelessness in his early 20s, followed by recovery and a second career as a radio personality in Philadelphia, Boston, and other markets. He has consistently been the most candid voice about what the Partridge Family experience actually involved, and his willingness to describe the exploitation and the difficulties alongside the genuine fun has made his retrospective interviews more useful as historical documents than the more guarded accounts from other cast members. Susan Day's post-show career was the most professionally distinguished of any cast member except Shirley Jones. Her Emmy-nominated portrayal of Grace Van Owen in L.A. Law from 1986 through 1992 established a serious adult acting career that had nothing to do with the Partridge legacy and proved that the talent she had shown on the show was the start of something rather than the peak. As Cassidy reflected in interviews in the final years of his life, he died on November 21, 2017, at the age of 67 from organ failure. He came to regard the show's place in American culture with more generosity than he had managed during its production or immediately after. He said, "I spent so long running from it. The irony is that I probably should have embraced it sooner, because it was what it was. And what it was turned out to be more meaningful to more people than I could have imagined at 20 years old."
I said I don't want any ice cream.
Read.
Mr. Kincaid, I don't want any ice cream.
What the show left behind. The Partridge Family's legacy is more complicated than the forgotten 1970s sitcom designation might suggest, and measuring it requires accounting for things that are not easily quantified in ratings or chart positions. The music catalog has proven more durable than most pop television productions of the era. I Think I Love You in particular has maintained the kind of cultural half-life recognizable on first listen to anyone who has spent time with oldies radio, licensed repeatedly for advertising and film soundtracks, covered and sampled across multiple decades, that most #1 singles from 1970 have not managed. The music that came out of the Partridge Family production was, by the standards of its moment, genuinely good pop craft, and it reflects well on Wes Farrell's production work and on the session musicians who recorded it, that the material has aged as well as it has. The show is also, viewed from a historical distance, a reasonably complete documentation of the teen idol industrial complex of the early 1970s. What it looked like from the inside, how it functioned, what it did to the people at the center of it, and what the institutional indifference to those people's well-being produced over time. The stories that came out of the show's production, Bonadeuce's financial exploitation, Day's eating disorder, Cassidy's increasing desperation to be something other than what he'd been made into, are not unique to the Partridge Family. They are representative of a pattern that repeated itself across multiple productions of the era, and that eventually produced the regulatory and cultural changes that made the entertainment industry somewhat less casually exploitative of young performers. The show premiered on ABC on September 25, 1970, at a moment when network television was genuinely the primary shared entertainment experience of American family life, and it ended on March 23, 1974, at a moment when that centrality was beginning to be questioned. In between, it was for a period one of the most commercially successful entertainment properties in the United States, and the people inside it experienced that success in ways that the audience watching them never fully understood. The Partridge Family was, in the end, exactly what it looked like. A product designed to extract commercial value from a specific cultural moment, executed with enough skill to produce genuine pop hits and genuine cultural resonance, and sustained until the conditions that made it successful changed enough that sustaining it further was no longer commercially rational. That is what most successful entertainment products are. The specificity of the Partridge Family's story is in the detail of how the success was experienced by the people who made it, which is almost always more complicated than the audience's experience of watching it. The Partridge Family ran for 96 episodes over 4 seasons, produced a string of genuine pop hits that have outlasted the show itself, and created a cultural moment that the people inside it experienced very differently from how it appeared on screen. The collapse was gradual and driven by multiple overlapping forces: Cassidy's growing ambivalence, the industry's casual exploitation of its younger cast members, the unsustainability of a music formula that depended entirely on Cassidy's participation, and the simple nature of teen idol celebrity, which burns intensely and briefly and then stops. What is left is the music, the photographs, the documentation, and the retrospective accounts of the people who lived it, all of which together produce a picture of what American entertainment looked like at the moment it was most sure of itself. Hit that like button and subscribe. More content like this coming.